Amen. Good morning, everybody. I'm excited to be here today. How about you? Yeah. All right. So we're in the second week of a series called A Rebel's Guide to Joy, and we're walking through the book of Philippians to see how we can cultivate this incredible, unconquerable joy in our lives, even in the middle of difficult circumstances, because once we give our lives to Jesus, we become citizens of a rebel kingdom. This countercultural community that sees life and death through an entirely different lens. And each week during this series, we're looking at a different ingredient, a different aspect of building up this kind of joy in us. And last week we talked about unity, how we can find incredible joy in being a community and being a space where everybody, no matter who they are or where they come from, can be welcomed in. And next week, you're not going to want to miss next week, we're going to talk about finding joy in humility. But this week we're taking a look at my favorite verse in the entire Bible. It's my aspirational life motto. And I say aspirational because I'm not always living into it, but I really, really want to be. And the ingredient that we're going to talk about this week, the thing that we got to throw into the pot if we want to cook up joy in our lives, is surrender. Bear with me for a minute on that, because I know that as soon as we hear that word surrender, something inside our hearts and our souls wants to put a hand up. We hear surrender and we think surrender is something for weak people. Surrender is something for people who lack ability or lack bravery. Surrender is something that should never be done. But I want to challenge us this morning with the idea that sometimes surrender is the most courageous choice. Sometimes, in fact, surrender is the only wise choice. I was on a mission trip with about 40 high school students. We were down in South Texas working with a church of Mexican immigrants. And on the last day that we were there, we took everyone to South Padre Island, to the beach, just for fun and relaxation. And we had a few students who swam pretty far out into the Gulf to ride some big waves, and they discovered a sandbar a long ways out there. And so naturally, a bunch of other students tried to make their way there. But they weren't all the strongest swimmers. One guy in particular by the name of Rob kind of headed out on his own to get to the sandbar, and it's impossible to keep track of that many kids on the beach. So I didn't even know that Rob had left the shore until about 10 minutes later when I watched Grant dragging him back onto the beach. And in what can only be described as a God moment, amidst all the chaos and the laughter and the noise out there in the ocean, Grant had heard the words, "A little help here?" And he looked over just in time to see Rob's head dipping under the waves. And Grant was working as a lifeguard at the time, so he swam over and he grabbed Rob and he started trying to drag him to the shore. But Rob, we'll put it this way, Rob wasn't the easiest customer. Rob had some special needs, and he was a stubborn guy who liked to do things his way and did not like to follow directions. And so he was fighting. He was trying to swim along with Grant or use Grant to climb up, and finally Grant just had to yell at him, "Rob, lay there and I will take you back to the shore. But if you keep swimming and you keep fighting, I'm going to let you go because you're going to drown us both. I'm not going to let it happen. You just have to trust me." And thankfully, Rob did. I wonder how often in life we're living like Rob out there in the ocean. Just struggling, fighting, trying to get there on our own, striving to get where we want to get for the sake of ourselves, believing completely in the mythology of self-sufficiency and barely keeping our heads above the water. I just think we chase happiness and we chase meaning in this life through so many different things. We chase it through work and grades and achievement and wealth and sex and power and beauty and popularity and success. And then we get tossed around by the waves of this life, by grief and loss and brokenness and temptation and failure and pain. And we realize that we're drowning. And all that stuff hasn't really bought or brought what we thought it would. It hasn't delivered what it promised, and doing it on our own just isn't working. And I think our first response to that is to try to compromise a little. We look up and we ask God for a little help here, and then we keep on trying to do it on our own. We hope that the little help God provides us will be the push we need to get what we want. We hope that God will come alongside us in chasing our selfish dreams and our selfish motives and our self-focused pursuits, that he'll help us get where we wanted to go all along, and it just doesn't work. It just doesn't work. Chasing all that stuff that our world has promised will make us happy. And what I want us to see this morning is that choosing surrender is the rebel choice in a world hard bent towards self-reliance. Because choosing not to surrender, choosing to be Rob out there in the ocean, fighting to make it on our own, doesn't work because God doesn't work that way. And he doesn't work that way because he knows that all that stuff that we're chasing for our own sakes is empty, and he made us for so much more. This morning I want to kind of lean into what that more is, what that more looks like. So if you have your Bibles, you can open them up to Philippians chapter 1. Sandwiched right between Ephesians and Colossians. Remember, this is a letter that Paul wrote to a church he'd planted in Philippi from prison. And he wrote this letter about a decade after he started the church. And what he does here is paints for this church an incredible picture of what happens when we surrender our lives completely to God. If you don't have a Bible with you this morning, don't worry, the words will be up on the screen, or you can open them up in the revision app. And if you need a Bible, we got a bunch of them in adult and kids versions of the Next Steps table. Please take one before you go. Okay, so Philippians 1, we covered the greeting last week. Today we're going to pick it up in verse 12. And when we hit verse 12, I want you to know, if there's anyone in history who's ever had a reason to feel like they're drowning, feel like they're overwhelmed, feel like life is just completely beating them down and not working, it's Paul right here. Okay, he's in prison. On his way to prison, he got in a shipwreck in the Mediterranean Sea. The ship hit a giant rock. They ran aground on an island. And then, because Paul's a good dude, he was trying to build a fire right after the shipwreck to keep everybody warm so everyone wouldn't die. And he reached into a pile of firewood, and a viper bit him in the hand. And so everyone thought he was going to die because he had poison coursing through his veins. So Paul, right here, as he writes this, is a shipwrecked, snake-bitten jailbird. And this is what he writes. Now, I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me, shipwreck, snakebite, prison, has actually served to advance the gospel. As a result, it's become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone that I am in chains for Christ. And because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear. So Paul writes to the church in Philippi, check it out, what's happened to me, this imprisonment is actually advancing the mission of Jesus in the world. I'm in jail. I think I'm going to get out. I don't know if I'm going to get out, but anyways, check out what God is doing through it. The whole palace guard knows the story of Jesus. And quick time out, the word that he uses for palace guard here is this Greek word Praetorian. And it could be used in a few different contexts. It could mean like the palace guard at the residence of a regional king like Herod. But most scholars believe that this letter to Philippi was written from Rome. And so the most logical reading and understanding of this word right here is that Paul had shared the story of Jesus with the Praetorian Guard. And in case you're not a giant history nerd like me, that's these guys from the movie Gladiator. Okay, the guys in the background. They were the elite special forces unit of the Roman legions, the personal protectors of the emperor himself, and they were charged with guarding prisoners waiting to have a trial with the emperor. These were a legendary crew of soldiers. Everybody knew them. And Paul writes to this church in Philippi, you guys, I shared the story of Jesus with the Praetorian Guard. And because I did that, not just them, all the prisoners too, because I did that, because I had the courage to share the gospel with these guys, the whole church in Rome got more bold. They're like, well, if Paul can tell those guys about Jesus, I can tell my neighbor, probably. Hashtag God is on the move in Rome. I love it, because here's Paul in like the worst possible situation, and what he shows us is this. We can find joy despite difficult circumstances. We can find joy despite difficult circumstances. His circumstances could not be any worse, and yet here he is. Last week I mentioned if you were a church hater in the first century and you were trying to crush Paul's spirit, you would have just been so frustrated because he's unbreakable. And here's just another example of that. He's sitting there in prison with this joy that is so on fire that it cannot be quenched. They locked him up, and he thought, sweet, what a neat chance to tell the biggest, baddest, meanest, scariest guys in this entire empire that they are weak, frail, and hopeless without Jesus. He's a wild man. He's a wild man. So he says, man, I'm telling the Praetorian Guard, and everybody in Rome is getting more bold because I'm doing that. And then he kind of shifts gears a little bit in verse 15. He writes, it's true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. The latter do so out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing they can stir up trouble for me while I'm in chains. But what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached, and because of this, I rejoice. So Paul starts describing this other difficulty that he's facing. Not only is he locked up in prison, but he's looking out at the church, like all these different churches that he started, and he sees this power struggle going on. There's a leadership vacuum because a strong leader like Paul has been removed from the equation. He's in jail and in Rome, right? And he sees people trying to fill this leadership vacuum, and some of them are trying to fill it because they want to continue the mission, and some of them are trying to fill it because they want the power. And it's not shocking. This is what happens in the world. You take a look time and time again throughout history, like when Alexander the Great, he died suddenly, and a whole bunch of people clamored for his role and his power, and really quickly after he died, the kingdom got split into 4 parts, and within 20 years, the strongest empire the world had ever seen had completely crumbled. So it's not surprising this is happening, but Paul's heart is breaking. He's sitting here in prison, he can't do anything about it, and he's looking out, and there are people who are power hungry, people who are selfish, people who are using the church so that God can help them get glory rather than the other way around. Thankfully, we don't have any leaders like that in the world today. But here's Paul, right? And he's looking out and he sees this situation going on. And he shows us, I think, that we can have joy despite difficult opposition. We can have joy despite difficult opposition, because his response to this is not the response most of us would have. I look at my own life, and as best I know myself, this is not the response I would have if I got locked away and I saw somebody leading the church, leading this church for their own gain and their own ambition and their own glory. It would just be so upsetting, and Paul says, who cares? They think they're doing it for them. God's going to use it for him. The important thing is that Jesus gets preached. And it blows my mind that Paul can have joy in that situation, because here's Paul. He's in the darkest possible place right now. I mean, eventually when he was in Rome, he got moved to house arrest, but he's writing this from behind bars. We'll do a real quick audience participation moment. How many of you think that prison sounds like fun and you want to go there someday? Seriously, raise your hands. Anybody? Bueller? Nobody? All right. I got a friend named Pete who's a prison guard for a long time. I think he'd say you made a good choice. He had some crazy, crazy stories. But understand this, like, none of us even want to go to prison today in the 21st century. In the first century, Paul had it way worse than we could possibly imagine. Like back then, prisons didn't have cable TV. You couldn't watch The View every day. Prisons didn't have snack time. There were no ice cream sandwiches in prison back in Paul's day. They didn't have recess so you could go out and hang in the yard for a little while. And there was nobody checking to make sure you got 3 square meals a day. And not just that, you didn't even know if or when you'd be tried. Paul didn't have a constitutional right to a speedy trial by a jury of his peers. They could just leave you there to rot. And he's sitting there, not knowing when or if he's ever going to get out, watching selfish people try and co-opt this thing that he planted for the sake of Jesus. And he says, who cares? Christ is being preached. And if it were me, I know, I'd be like in the fetal position in the corner crying, God, please get me out. And I'd be kind of mad, right? I'd be like, God, how come I'm in prison? I'm trying to do this for you. And there's these jerks out there. Lock them up. They're bad. I'm good. Set me free. But here's Paul. And if you know anything about Paul, you know he's just writing this with a big, dumb grin on his face. I rejoice. I was in Lydia's mansion for a while. I rejoiced. I'm in this dungeon. I rejoice. I rejoice. Rebel joy. And then he writes this. Yes, and I will continue to rejoice. For I know that through your prayers and God's provision of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, what has happened to me will turn out for my deliverance. I eagerly expect and hope that I will in no way be ashamed, but will have sufficient courage so that now, as always, Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by my life or by my death. See, Paul knows something that allows this rebel joy to flow through him in every situation. He knows that deliverance is coming this side or the other. Everything around him looks dark and broken and gloomy, but Paul knows that prison is not the last chapter of his story. And he can have courage and he can have joy because he knows that death itself does not get to write the final chapter of his story. And that's why he's able to say succinctly and clearly what he says next. For to me, to live is Christ and to die is gain. You guys read that with me? Ready? For to me, to live is Christ and to die is gain. I think that's the craziest, most revolutionary thing anyone has ever written in the history of humanity. It's my favorite verse in the Bible. It's my life motto that I hope I can live into. And I want to lean in for a minute to what Paul meant when he said that and what it means for our lives. To live as Christ meant that Jesus is the source and the purpose of Paul's life. Paul's a guy who had some wealth and he had some education and he's been all around the world. He's seen all kinds of people. And when he writes that, he says, Jesus is the only thing, the one thing in all that I've seen and all that I've experienced that I have found is worth living for and giving my life to. And Jesus is the only place where real true life can even be found. Paul knew that his time was limited and he didn't want to waste a single moment, and so he gave all of his moments to the one thing that matters for eternity, the eternal one. We got to realize that was just as countercultural when Paul wrote it in the first century as it would be today. It was just as crazy. Like Philippi was a wealthy Macedonian trading port. And so if you had seen Paul as he arrived on the shores of the cities, he sailed up the river and landed in Philippi, you would have seen the scene that surrounded him. There were a bunch of merchants and ships. You'd have seen a businessman looking at his ledger as he watched the cargo get loaded onto the ship and put his hand on his money bag and said, for me to live is gold. You'd have seen a dock worker loading the cargo onto the ships who said, well, for me to live is just putting food on the table for my family. Standing off to the side, there had been a philosopher with a serious face, stroking his beard, looking condescendingly at both of them, saying, for me to live is knowledge. And still another in a breastplate and a helmet and a sword, who said, for me to live is glory. And off the ship would hop this little Jewish tent maker and church planner, who says, for me to live is Christ. And they would have looked at him like he was crazy, like he was nuts. Everyone would have looked at him and just laughed and said, Christ, the guy who got killed, that's worth living for? What a stupid thing to live your life for. But Paul knew something they didn't. He knew the gospel and he knew that that's what mattered. Paul was completely possessed with the idea that life is about Jesus and sharing him with the people around us, that that's where life can truly be found. And I'm pretty sure the responses in our day and age from the people around us would be pretty similar. If we walked out and said, for me to live as Christ, people would look at us like we were nuts. We live in a culture where so many people believe that to live is money or power, success, fame, achievement, grades, popularity. What is it for you? Truth is, not one of those things satisfies. They're empty. Not one of them matters for eternity. Not one of them can give us any confidence or hope in death at all. Paul tells us the only thing worth giving our lives to if we want to truly live is Jesus. That if we want to make our lives count, if we want to take seriously the fact that time is fleeting and we are dying, then living for Jesus is the only way. Real, true life, unbreakable, rebel joy and purpose and meaning is found in Jesus and in sharing him with our world. And when our lives are defined by that, when that's the goal and the aim that we are headed towards, then we can have an unshakable confidence that death is gain. That death is gain. I think that part of the statement, the second half, is even more crazy and even more countercultural than the first. I mean, people might think we're crazy to choose Jesus and pursue Jesus over money and sex and fame, but they think we're nuts to say that death is winning. Are we? It's this idea in particular that I think is missing from the faith of a whole lot of people in the Western world. It's part of this great disease, this rot that is infecting the heart of American evangelicalism and rendering it useless and powerless while killing it off from the inside. We are so caught up in living for this life, for the here and now. We're obsessed with thinking about how God can help us in that pursuit. How God can come alongside us in getting what we want and helping us achieve the wealth that we want, the power that we want, the status that we want, so that we can live our best life right now. And because of that, we shy away from living boldly. We shrink back from sharing faith, and we walk away from being the kind of community that welcomes everybody in, no matter who they are and no matter what they've done, because we are so obsessed with cultivating comfort and maximizing this moment right here. But Paul writes in another letter, this letter to the Corinthians, first one, that if our hope is only for this life, then we are to be pitied above all people, even the pagans. Because there's a greater day coming, one when all things will be made new and all things will be set right, and we can find joy and purpose and meaning in living for that moment. And aiming our lives in that direction rather than aiming them towards the empty pursuits of a vain and shattered world. Is it crazy to say death is gain? Not if you know what death holds. That death has no sting and it has no victory, none. None. Which means we can find scandalous joy right now by living for eternity. Here's Paul, he's facing death. And he shows us that we can find joy despite difficult prospects. He's sitting in prison. His prospects could not be more grim. He doesn't know it yet, but he's never getting out. Never. This is the end. Within a few years, Nero's going to kill him. We don't know whether he got beheaded or killed in the arena, the Colosseum, but what we know is he didn't live long after this. He was never a free man again. His prospects are grim, and some of ours are too. But listen, the future doesn't have to be bright for you in order for you to find joy. We don't always know what the future holds, but we can have joy because we know who holds the future. So Paul writes this crazy, incredible statement, more like a manifesto for me: to live as Christ and to die is gain. And then he sums it up with a challenge to the church. Kind of tells them, look, this is what it looks like to live this out. In verse 27, he writes, whatever happens, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. Then, whether I come and see you or only hear about you in my absence, I will know that you stand firm in the one Spirit, striving together as one for the faith of the gospel without being frightened in any way by those who oppose you. Can I have a real honest moment with you guys? This feels like an impossible challenge to me. When he says, live your life in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ, if I'm being straight, that feels like something I cannot do. Live your life in a manner worthy of the creator of the universe stepping out of heaven into the human story and giving his life to be beaten and killed so that you could be saved. Like, sometimes I look in the mirror, and after my eyes adjust to the glare coming off of my head, I'm not even sure that I'm living a life worthy of being a dad to a couple 3-year-old morons who poop their pants all the time. Like, I don't even know if I'm living up to that, let alone living up to Jesus. And this challenge feels like, really? But Paul kind of explains what it looks like. He says, this is what I'm talking about. You want to live a life worthy of the gospel. You want to live out this manifesto. You want to find rebel joy in every situation, no matter what. Here's what it looks like. Stand firm together in the Spirit. Strive as one to share Jesus with your world fearlessly. He says that because he's writing, remember, to this crazy eclectic community. It got founded by a socialite, a slave, and a soldier. From the very beginning, this church at Philippi was multiracial, multi-socioeconomic, multicultural, multi-generational. And he's looking at them saying, man, if you want to live this out, keep your arms open. Keep creating this space where anybody and everybody can feel welcome. You live in a world with people who are desperate to feel love and desperate to feel acceptance. Keep being the kind of church that creates a space where they can feel love and acceptance. Keep creating that space, and don't wait for them to come to you. Don't hope that they're just going to come in, that they're going to flock to the church because you're so great. Go to where they are. Meet the broken people in the broken places where they live. Speak the grace and truth out to a dying world. And stop letting fear cripple you from living on this mission. I want us to know this morning. I want us to see it and to walk out believing it. Surrendering selfishness leads to a fearless future. If you've been afraid to live like Jesus, if you haven't had the courage to walk out and to live out this manifesto, and all of us have, man, I've been in that spot. I'm in that spot weekly. This is a daily battle. But if sometimes deep inside you, you lack the bravery to say, for me to live is Christ and to die is gain, surrendering selfishness will take away your fear. Surrendering selfishness leads to a fearless future. Can we live like that? I think we can. Even if it's intimidating. The church in Philippi did. And I know sometimes it's easy for us to read the Bible and assume that all the people in there are different than we are. Right? They feel like untouchable heroes. Even the three people we talked about last week, the founders of this church at Philippi, Lydia and the demon-possessed slave girl and the jailer who tortured Paul and Silas. We read it and we think, well, I can't be like them. They're in the Bible. I'm sure when they got this letter from Paul, they just got right to it. I'm sure they never struggled with fear. They didn't shrink back from sharing Jesus with the people around them. They probably never chased the world. They're Bible characters, and we believe that we couldn't do what they did because, they're untouchable to us, and it's just not true. If you think that Lydia never again struggled with pride, if you think she didn't struggle with putting her hope in her money ever again, if you think that the slave girl didn't battle bitterness, that her parents sold her when she was a little girl so they could make money, if you think the soldier didn't have some rough edges and didn't want some glory for himself sometimes, you're just wrong. They did. They were human. So are you. You don't have to be Paul. You don't have to be a Bible superhero. You don't even have to be perfect to quit chasing the emptiness of this world and start finding rebel joy and meaning and purpose in Jesus. You just have to be surrendered. The missionary Elizabeth Elliot said it like this. I love it. She said, when the will of God crosses the will of man, somebody has to die. It's that simple. So my challenge to you this week is to die. To die to you. To die, to be in a rob out there in the ocean, struggling to chase what you want all on your own. Being tossed by the waves of life and wondering why you're drowning. Die to this constant process of wondering why success and money and popularity and sex and power and grades and achievement and stuff have not brought you joy that lasts, and surrender. Just trust God completely with your future. Because here's the truth. If you want joy that lasts, if you want to live with this rebel joy in every single situation of your life, you will never, ever find it through the ways of this kingdom. Through the methods of this world. It can only be found through the ways of the rebel kingdom, and the way of the rebel kingdom is surrender. I know it's not easy. It's scary and it's intimidating. But I want to encourage you to make that trade. To surrender, because you're only giving up the things that have left you time and time again empty and tempest-tossed, to gain the thing that leaves you full of hope and joy. Jesus told this story in Matthew 13 about a guy who found a buried treasure in a field, which wouldn't have been weird in the first century. They didn't have banks, so people buried gold in fields. And he went out and he sold absolutely everything that he had so he could go buy this field. And all of his friends and all his family looked at him like he was a crazy person to sell everything to get this field. But the thing is, he knew what he was getting when he made the trade, and so do we. So do we. We know exactly what we're getting when we give up the world to go chasing after Jesus. Fearless purpose and joy. I just believe if you'll do it, if we'll do it right here and right now, Jesus is going to work in and through our lives to make an impact here and now in this place. I know some of you don't believe that. Some of you still just aren't convinced that you can make a difference, that you have the gifts or the abilities to do it. You feel too small, too insignificant, and too ill-equipped to actually believe that even if you embrace this life motto, even if you went chasing after Jesus, anything good could happen in and through your life. But I'll tell you what, I decided this a long time ago for me. I think this is how Paul lived his life, and I believe that it's true for every single one of us in here. I have no control over the talent that has been placed inside of me. I have no control over the level of intelligence or the particular abilities God gave me or the laundry list of abilities God did not give me. All I have is the ability to entrust what I've got to God, to cultivate and maximize whatever potential I have and surrender myself to Him to be used however He wants for His purpose, believing that He made me for His reasons. And if I surrender to Him, He'll use me for His reasons. And He made you for His reasons too. And He made us on purpose. I just believe, I'm convinced Revision Church is here right now in this moment in history for God's purposes. And if we will surrender, we will find a fearless future. He'll fill us with this joy that is so unquenchable that it's contagious, that it spills out all over our world. I want to be a community like that. Will you guys pray with me? Heavenly Father, thank you. Thank you for creating us with the ability to experience joy in every single situation, with the ability to find life and find meaning and find purpose and find fearlessness even in a scary world by surrendering our lives to you. May that be the motto that we live out. To live is Christ and to die is gain. Thank you for the hope that we have even in death, that you are our future, you're our reason and you're our purpose. Thank you for the joy that you give to us. In Jesus' name, amen.